Okay, if all is well, we are now live with this webinar on validation. We always like to do a quick sound check. Can everybody hear us well? If so, can you please leave a short message in the chat? Just says, okay, thumbs up, whatever. Loud and clear. Thank you, Matthijs. Okay, I think the technology is working. Again, that's good. So again, a warm welcome to this webinar on driving growth with innovation. It's the third in a series of 4. We are focusing on validation. How do you do that? And we are organizing these webinars because we've recently launched our innovation playbook. Our corporate innovation playbook has been downloaded over 2,500 times already. And the overall feedback is that people really like the comprehensive overview of the playbook with a lot of best practice tooling. So we thought it would be a good idea to organize a series of webinars around the playbook. We're now on October. The next one, by the way, is November 4th. And that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for the introduction. As you can see, this webinar and basically innovation as a process has 3 main challenges. And in the first webinar we introduced those 3 innovation challenges. You can see them on the slide. Each organization will have to go through these 3 challenges to successfully innovate. Each of these challenges, by the way, requires a specific approach, and each of these specific approaches is going to be discussed in one of our webinars. And as you may have guessed by now, the webinar you're following at this moment is about the middle stage. It's about the validation challenge. Next to these 3 stages in innovation, we basically use 4 well-known management methodologies or business principles in innovation. And in the first webinar, we talked extensively about these methodologies. In the upcoming webinars, but also today, we'll go into more detail about these principles and explain how they can be used in each of the innovation phases. Let's move on. And as you would have guessed also, the playbook covers these methodologies and these phases in much more detail. Again, if you haven't downloaded it yet, it describes all the methodologies and all the tools that are being discussed in this and all of the other webinars. And in these webinars, we'll highlight the tools and methodologies most used based on real-life examples from working with actual clients.
Well, having said that, just starting a little bit with the technology, having left my laptop at home. Yeah, can you, René, if you can do the clicking.
Sure, yeah.
Just to introduce ourselves, my name is Mark Dauma. I've been hosting some of the other webinars as well. Today, I'll be supported and joined by René. We're both co-founder of RevelX. And behind the controls is our chief commercial guy, Rob Nouwens, who will make sure that the technology runs smoothly as always. Just shortly about RevelX, we're a boutique consultancy and we help our clients to realize growth through innovation. We work with large corporates as well as smaller scale-ups who aim to become a large corporate. And we do that in a range of industries, a lot of B2B customers, but also a lot of B2C initiatives. And some of the examples will be shown today just as illustration on the kind of validation work that we do. In today's webinar, we're going to have 3 main sections. First of all, we're going to explain that will be done by René, what is validation and also what is not, what is it actually not. Then, of course, we're going to discuss how to validate effectively. And as already said, we're going to give you some practical tools, just a selection, by the way, a lot more to be found in our playbook, and also some real life examples, because in the end, I think that what really is the most interesting. We always like to have these webinars interactive. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. We may pick some of them up during the webinar as we go along with the presentation, and the other ones will then be addressed later on in the Q&A. So feel free to leave any questions and we'll have a look at them and try to cover them as much as possible. So let's start with a short poll. You can leave your answers in the chat, and we're always interested, why are you here today? What do you hope to get out of this? So what's the reason for joining this webinar today? You can give your answer in the chat on the right of your screen. Well, there's either people have not yet found the chat or we're a bit hesitant to share that. Learning about failures and successes. Marcel, innovation is our core business. Well, that's good. And I hope we can still give you some new insights. Becoming better in validating our innovations. Daniela, thank you for that. Well, let's hope that you can learn something out of that.
There's an interesting one. Learn how to deal with the hobby horses.
Well, we always say the hobby horses need to be killed, but that's a bit that's maybe a bit too direct. Fresh perspective. Well, let's hope that we can live up to all these expectations. So validation, René.
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, what's validation, or actually, what does it seem to be? Well, to be honest, when we look at many of our customers, validation seems to be the following, and let me give you pre-warning, which actually it isn't. Nevertheless, most of our companies, or many of our companies, they seem to think that validation is, let's say, all about the detailed engineering or design of a new product or service, making a beautiful sales presentation out of that, and possibly setting up a marketing campaign, then producing the new product or prototypes of it, and subsequently setting up all processes and organizational aspects to sell and deliver the new product at scale. Launching the fully developed product into a market with a lot of marketing and sales power, and then to find out whether or not, and more often not than actually successful, to find out whether it will be a success or not. And as said, more often not than it is. And this is all well, quite surprising, and you may want to ask yourself, and that's what we also did, of course, is why does it always happen like this? And that's basically driven by the desire to look really professional. It's because many organizations, and especially the more technically oriented organizations, they often work much more product driven than customer driven. And they usually only dare to enter a market with a new product or service when everything is totally well thought through, when they're 100% confident that all the possible objections can be covered, and they can make just the same impression with the innovative products as they normally do with the products and services that have been around and have been marketed and sold for many, many years. Now, and there are way too many examples of innovations that have failed this way. Without going into details, but even companies like Apple with the Apple Newton, a company called Microsoft, you might have heard of them, at a certain moment in time introduced a new product called Zoom. Facebook introduced a product called Facebook Home. Pepsi once came up with a breakfast drink. McDonald's came up with the luxury versions of their restaurants called McDonald's Arts Deluxe, and basically all those new products and services, they failed miserably.
Okay.
Nice. And of course, all these examples, they were validated. At least that's what we thought that would have happened. But in the end, still, they turned out to be insufficiently in demand. So something must have gone wrong also in the innovations, even with big companies like Microsoft, Apple, PepsiCo, etc. And that's precisely the reason why we thought that it might be worthwhile to create this webinar, and that is to really help with validating innovative ideas in the right way. So, what is validation really? Actually, validation is mostly about acquiring maximum knowledge, as much as knowledge as possible at the lowest possible cost and as fast as possible. Now, knowledge is, of course, quite an abstract thing. So, knowledge about what? Knowledge about three things. First of all, is the customer problem I want to solve sufficiently large and sufficiently urgent? Secondly, is my product or service a real solution to the customer problem? And thirdly, can I deliver that solution in a way that the customer actually wants it and at a price that the customer is willing to pay for my new products or services? So those are the three things that you absolutely have to find out while validating a new innovation. So, as counterintuitive as this may seem, validation is actually not about selling your innovation. Far too often companies try to sell their innovation, and if they succeed, they claim that the product has been validated. And this selling those innovations is often done in a one-to-one personal sales situation. And in that situation, of course, you may still be able to actually sell your innovation. But in many cases, you'll find out later that this doesn't work in a fully scaled up situation, in which normally the cost of acquisition of a new customer needs to come down, and personal sales may end up much too costly. So when validating, it's of the utmost important to not really sell your minimum viable solution. We'll come back to a minimum viable solution later, or your final product, but to really ask your potential customer as critically as possible whether he or she really needs your innovation and why and for what and how he intends to use it. So it's basically about asking the questions that you're most afraid of hearing the answers to. So validating can actually be quite uncomfortable. So having said all that, and having sort of defined on a rather high level, of course, because of time limitations, let's go to a quick poll. And we were really curious to find out how good is your organization at validating your innovations.
And so, and if you're working as a consultant, because we also have some sort of colleague consultants joining, which we always like. Can you please answer this question for the last customer you've been working for?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah. Okay, so we see the answers coming in. We see troubling, 12%. Poor, 48%, okay-ish, 33%, good, only 7%.
Yeah, and this is, it's interesting, and it's actually, you're in good company, I would almost say, because to be honest, we do a lot of work on innovation projects, and I think most of the projects are not so much focused on ideation, because we see a lot of customers who have a lot of ideas, they've been, but the thing is, how can we actually get them to scale up? But then, the question often comes down to, do we actually know whether this is a good solution or not? So, and we will give some examples later on. So this is really an area where a lot of companies struggle with. 60% of the audience says, well, it's troubling to poor. Let's hope we know if we're a year down the road with all the knowledge we're sharing today, that at least that number or that percentage has gone down. Having said that, because in the end, René, can you maybe click, because I'm still out of laptop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Incredible. Because ultimately, in the end, validation is about beating your competition in terms of the time to market. And that's the main reason why you invest in that. And this may seem a bit as a paradox, because in the end, validation takes time. But we think you should especially take that time when the time pressure is very high. Because sometimes, as they say, you have to go slow to go fast. And quite often we see companies rushing to the market because they really want to be there first without having done a proper validation, and only to then find out that their customers really don't like it or don't appreciate the solution. And just quite an expensive example, at one of our clients, they were very interested in moving into the market of what we call the BHV'ers, the bedrijf hulpverleners, or the emergency response officers in English. And they decided to develop an application on mobile devices that the emergency response officers could use in case of an emergency. They invested around 100,000 euros in that app development, and only then found out that there were some very critical functions missing when they did their first sort of customer pitch. They tried to sell it. And then, we did sort of a post-mortem validation, you could almost say, because we then did kind of the proper validation and said, well, is this really a viable solution? And we had to conclude that it would never become a competitive solution compared to all the other options that were available in the market. And so they really rushed into this without, I think, a proper validation. And in the end, that was quite a costly investment. The good news is that we are now we're still working with them on a SaaS platform, software as a service platform. And based on that experience, they said, now we need to do it right. So we are now actually in the midst of all kinds of customer validation interviews They're running in the next month. So in that way, we're now avoiding the mistake they've made in the beginning. If we move on to the next, I think you're familiar with the Lean Startup philosophy, because that's exactly what Lean Startup is all about. It's about taking a minimal viable product as soon as possible to the market to validate it. And Renee said, you need to get knowledge as fast as possible, but it also should be as early as possible in the innovation stage, instead of coming up with a fully engineered end product, like you already explained in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then also to adjust it based on the feedback that you get from your customers. I think you're familiar with the core steps in the Lean Startup approach. You see them here summarized on this sheet. And in the remaining part of our webinar, we will discuss each of these and also illustrate it with a couple of examples. René already said we have the minimal viable solution. And I think you're familiar with the MVP. We often prefer the minimal viable solution, because in the end, innovation is often not only about a product, although a lot of companies tend to focus on that. They're very much on the product side of innovation, but it should actually be a whole concept of services around that product and new ways of distribution or new ways of customer interaction. So it's really about solutions. And well, it's the minimum version of, if you talk about an MVS, that's basically the minimal version of your product or service with which you can go out to the market to actually test whether customers want that. And it does not have to be perfect. On the contrary, I think it was the LinkedIn founder, Reid Hoffman, who once said, if you're not a little ashamed of your MVS, you're actually developed it too far. So it's kind of like almost a bit embarrassing to go out there but as René already explained, this is not about selling the solution. This is not about developing the business. This is actually testing whether there is a good fit for that. Which brings us to the next sheet, which is, in the end, validation is all about finding the right fit. And René already said it's about getting knowledge around three things. And here you see them again, but in a more structured way. It's the problem-solution fit. Do we have a problem that is worth solving? And that's about the customer jobs to be done, the pains and gains, and the way we can address that with our value proposition. The second fit has to be the solution market fit. Have we built something that customers really want? And the third one, and that's equally important, that's the business model fit. Can the business model that we develop, is that viable? So is that economically feasible, but is it also scalable? Because if you want to sort of sell it at large, then you need to make sure that you can actually produce the numbers that are required in a robust, scalable, and also profitable way. Just as an example, which I think highlights each of these three fits very well. Next sheet, please. We have been recently gotten involved with, what I would call a revolutionary new e-bike concept. And unfortunately, we cannot disclose the name of the company, and we have to be a bit general, in terms of what it is about, because the project is still ongoing. But it's about an e-bike concept, and it's, by the way, not the bike that is shown here on this picture, but that's basically to illustrate what I think a lot of people do not know is that bikes are actually being produced in the same way with the same kind of components for around 100 years. There's not a lot of innovation going on, in terms of materials, but in terms of how the bike looks like. It's still basically the bike that you see on this picture. And in the end, customers really want to have a super reliable bike with limited or low maintenance, especially if they're going to use it for commuting. So the client we're working for, they came up with, I think, a very interesting idea, and that was to develop a bike that is based on a revolutionary new technical design, but also on a very different way of manufacturing the bike that would result in a bike that's super reliable, requiring almost no maintenance, except some normal wear and tear. And in this case, if you take the three fits, there was, I think, a good problem solution fit, because customers don't like bikes to break down or to require a lot of maintenance. They also don't like to bring the bike to the bike dealer, especially if it's an e-bike, because they're very heavy. And they had that super reliable bike with a whole home service solution around it. The thing was that the bike design was a bit let's say, unorthodox. So we were a bit concerned whether the market would actually like it. So what we did, we actually decided to organize a large customer validation via an external agency. We approached 1,200 customers or potential buyers to test whether the design would actually fit their needs, well, their expectations, but also whether they would like all the USPs that this bike would offer. And the good news was that validation showed that it was indeed very viable. About half the people liked the design. There were 20% said, well, I really don't like the design. Well, that's always if you have something unorthodox. But it was good enough. It was more than good enough, actually. The problem, however, emerged in the whole supply chain, because in the end, the bike needed to be produced at scale. And because they opted for a very innovative way of manufacturing, they had lots of troubles finding the right supply chain partner who could actually do that in a reliable and scalable way. So eventually, despite 2 first positive fits, they decided to postpone the project for another year because they would never make the sales season next year, and it was just too uncertain in the whole supply chain. So there you see that even if you have the right solution that the market wants, if you cannot produce it at scale, you just have to be careful and launch again into the market, because that would lead to a lot of disappointments. And I think it was quite a courageous decision. And René already said, it's always a bit scary to do that kind of validation.
Asking the most terrifying questions.
Exactly.
Now, maybe, Mark, there is a question in the chat that nicely relates to this particular topic. So the question was asked by Niels. Thank you so much, Niels, for that. And the question is, when do you do these 3 fits in time, all at the same time, or do you start with problem solution fit first? Now, maybe Mark,
I think
thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think you can work a lot on the business model, but if there's not a problem solution fit, I think in the end it all starts. That's also, I think, the principle around design thinking. I need to have a customer problem that is worth solving. And I think that's where you really should start. And I think in the end, then it will become an iterative approach, because what we, for example, found out is that we needed to make some design changes to the bike. And then the question is still, okay, is this then still a solution to the problem our customers have? So I think it can be iterative.
So looking at it from a distance, you would first solve a problem solution fit, then solution market fit, and then business model fit. But in all these 3 stages, you're very likely to encounter problems that will sort of force you back to the drawing board, and then maybe do a bit more of problem solution fitting while already in the business model fitting stage.
But then it's actually helpful that you're doing that with a minimum viable solution. So we have a poll around that.
Let's move to that one. So question here is, how often does your organization use or work with minimum viable solutions in the validation process?
Well, somebody was very quick saying never. That was like within 1 second. That was good. Sometimes very often. That's good to see. So a couple of people very often. I think that's also a bit similar to what we see at our clients. It's still not something that is very common. Unfortunately, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. There was another question in the chat. Can we just go back to that question, because Tom also asked a question, and he said, is there a way to have a minimum viable product or minimum viable solution that's interesting enough for your potential clients, the early adapters, without scaring them off forever? And we think there is. And as the founder of LinkedIn said, well, your new product should be just good enough not to scare off your clients. So you should actually, you may actually feel a bit embarrassed for coming up with your new product, but as long as you don't sell it, but you're making it totally clear to your customers that you're validating a new idea. So don't raise expectations too high, and actually make it more part of a research project than part of trying to sell something. That would be our answer to that question. Let's see, where are we at? We are at fast prototyping. So When building a minimum viable solution, it is of the utmost important that you quickly and cheaply make a good prototype of your product and service, and it can be done with much less effort and much less resources than you might think. We still see many companies that go out onto the market to validate the product that has indeed been totally engineered, totally been produced, has all the bells and whistles to it, etc., etc. Whereas there are actually quite a few ways of working to go out onto the market in validating your minimum viable solution without building the whole thing. So there's, let me just go through a few of them. There's the so-called napkin sketch, which can be as simple as a drawing of the product and or service and show to your potential customer what it actually does. For digital services, you can use, for instance, Google Typeform to simulate the interaction that may happen on a digital service platform. Obviously, there can be things like a PowerPoint presentation, a scale model, a 3D print, a simple interactive website. Lots of stuff is possible as long as you make it totally clear to your customer what problem is being solved by your innovation and how it does that. And it should be done in such a way that your customer really gets some sort of feel as to what is this thing that's being validated, and I'm being asked to judge whether it would be a solution to one of the problems I may be facing. So don't go out and develop the whole product, but try to keep your minimum viable solution as minimal as possible. But still, it should be just enough to give your customer the feeling as to what it actually is that you're trying to validate.
And when then it comes to validation, I think in the end it's all about what are our riskiest assumptions. What are the things that we really want to sort of be proven to be sure that in the end, we are having the right idea. So whenever you're involved in an innovation, really sit down with the team and think about what are the key assumptions that we are now working on. That can be either a price point, that can be a design, that can be a kind of the way people want to use it. For example, in the e-bike example I talked about, we had the assumption that the bike, or the client actually had the assumption that the bike could be sold purely online, that people really didn't need the right experience. Well, that was quite critical, because if that's the way to sell it, then you're going to build a different kind of distribution model when people need actually to do kind of physical testing of a bike.
Yeah, and the fact that worked with Tesla quite well doesn't mean that it should also work with an e-bike.
For example, well, actually, what the validation also generated was the insight that people were willing to sort of go a long way online, but in the end really wanted to ride the bike, see the bike, experience the bike. So that led us to the conclusion that we needed to kind of pivot there. Well, what you can do, of course, when you define those assumptions, is to structure them in what we call the risk assumption or the riskiest assumption matrix. It's almost too simple to explain, but it's what are the assumptions, what goes well, what if they go wrong, what we do, but really also think about how you're going to validate them. I think that's the key part here. It's not only about thinking about the assumptions, but also thinking about the way you use, what do you use for actually validating them. Which brings us to the topic of, how do you then validate? And there are a lot of ways that can be done. I think the common denominator, by the way, is that in the end, the only way or the only place to do it is at your customers and nowhere else. So if you ask your own internal engineers, well, fine. But in the end, it's the customer that needs to give you the answer. Here you see 15 quite popular ways for validation. I won't go into sort of the detail of all of them. We'll just highlight a few. You can do customer interviews. That's what we're going to do for the SaaS platform I talked about. For the e-bike, we did actually customer panels, so that because we wanted to have larger numbers. You can create a simple landing page. We've done that for some of our clients, where basically, we look whether we could create traffic and whether people were actually taking certain actions on that landing page. A/B testing is obviously quite interesting. If we move ahead with the e-bike concept, we still need to think about, are people going to use it in sort of a regular way of using a bike, or are they going to use it because they want to have a more mobility solution, which is a different way of positioning it. And the plan was actually to do A/B testing on that in a later stage. And you can also do the concierge service, which kind of is interesting because what you may not know is that Booking.com actually started out that way. It's basically simulating your whole service without actually developing it. And in the very early days of Booking.com, I think the guy told us once he had 50 fax machines lined up where all the requests were coming in from customers, and then they went on their bike, actually went to the hotel or called the hotel and could see if they could actually make that booking.
Yeah.
And in the end, they found that people were actually willing to book hotel rooms via their platform, and only then did they scale up.
Yeah.
So it's not I think a common known story about the start of Booking.com, but that's exactly how they did it in the beginning. So, and then in the end, ultimately, you need to make sure that your hypotheses or riskiest assumptions are proven right or wrong. And in the end, you end up with the 3 fits. Now, René is going to give us an example of one of our clients, which is called Inbema, how they did it in that situation.
Yeah, interesting real-life story. Inbema is actually a Dutch technical trading company or technical wholesaler, and it generates roughly between 50 and 100 million turnover annually, of course. So not really a small company, but also not a very big company. It's active in industry, infrastructure, and construction and installation. And they mainly supply products that are being used in new installations, as well as products that are being used in the operations and maintenance phases of these industry, infrastructure, and construction sites. Inbema was actually in a strategic turnaround as the management of the company realized that the traditional business model of the wholesaler, picking up a box, bringing a box, a dime in between, or in Dutch, doosje halen, doosje brengen, duppie ertussen, that was actually getting under pressure. And they decided to strive to start increasing their added value in the value chain. And looking at technical trading companies or any trading companies, there are basically 2 directions possible. The first direction is to optimize your logistics processes, like delivery on a very exact location, on an exact time, putting local stock on a construction site, etc., etc. And the other direction is to provide various additional services on top of your products, such as project management, engineering and assembly of complete solutions, or maintenance or asset management services. And actually Inbema decided to go for an asset management strategy. This means that you help your customers to use their assets, which are basically their installations, as effectively and efficiently as possible. So then you start bringing solutions in terms of preventive maintenance, condition-based maintenance, and that sort of more intelligent services to get the maximum result out of using your assets. Actually, we were asked to guide the organization in developing and executing this strategy, which led to various concrete innovation projects. So, what needed to be validated? Actually, one of their industrial clients was a storage and transport company where a lot of internal transport on one of their big sites, transport of liquids, took place through a so-called hose pit. And a hose pit is actually a concrete basin in which tanks could be connected to each other by means of flexible hoses, so that a liquid could be pumped from one tank into another. However, a bottleneck in this process was the fact that the operator in the hose pit had to constantly call the control room to request approval to make a potentially dangerous connection. And this was very time consuming and sometimes an error prone part of the process. You can imagine the guy standing there wanting to make a connection between 2 tanks by using a flexible hose. And then every time before doing so, he had to control the control room and the guy in the control room had to look up in thick handbooks and databases whether this was actually an allowed connection. The innovative idea was to equip the man in the host pit with an app linked to data from the control room, on which he could immediately see for every possible connection whether this was an allowed connection or not. And having equipped that guy in the host pit with this app would would eliminate a very time-consuming and error-prone part of the process. And thus could contribute to the maximum utilization of these assets and maximum utilization of the employees as well. And there was some indication that the customer would think that this was actually quite a good idea, but we hadn't really validated it. So, how did we validate that? Well, we knew that developing a prototype would already require a significant investment, one that be surrounded by too many uncertainties. But we also knew what the approximate savings potential of this innovation would be for their customer based on some calculations and a business case we had made ourselves. So what we then did is we created a minimum viable solution of the product in Google Typeform and in PowerPoint, discussed it with the customer and refined it further based on his feedback. And the ultimate validation, and that was really interesting, was that we asked the customer to become a co-development and a co-investor for the innovation project in exchange for a significant discount on the first purchase of this newly developed product. And the scale-up potential was actually rolling out this innovation to the client's other nearly 70 international locations. So in actually having the customer as a participant in the development process of this innovation, and actually therefore also willing to spend real time and money and effort in the further development of this innovation, that made us certain that the customer really wanted and really needed this product, and therefore we could say the innovation had been validated. So moving on to the next part, I think it's back to you, Mark.
And that's basically using validation insights to make pivots. Veronique, by the way, has an interesting question. How do you know that you validate with the right pivot? Because with the right people. And that's an interesting one, Veronique, because obviously, if you're going to make big decisions based on the feedback you get on your validation, you really need to make sure that you found the right people. Mm-hmm. In the case of the e-bike company, we were, I wouldn't say lucky, because it was I think a conscious decision to work with an expert market research agency. I can do a bit of promo here. It was Motivaction, and they have the mentality model. And actually what they were able to do is segment the 1,200 people that were participating in the survey based on their mentality rating. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of way to sort of, it's a bit similar to personas, you could say. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, we actually could sort of link the answers to each of their, I think they have around 9 segments in their mentality model. Mm-hmm. So we could really sort of pinpoint where the answers were coming from and whether they were actually within our intended target group or not. And that was a very helpful way. If you're doing more customer interviews or in a more B2B setting, then I think in the end, it's really about knowing that you have the right people and also that they're going to give you sort of their honest answer, isn't it? So you have to sort of reach out to your trusted customers and see if they are willing to think with you.
Yeah, and to see if they're also willing to put their money where their mouth is. And money can be actual money, but it can also be time. So if you see in the validation process that the customer is actually committed to giving something back, so maybe get more people around the table, maybe to get his customers around the table, maybe to be a co-investor. I mean, it's very easy for someone to say, well, I like your product and I'm going to buy it. It's much more valuable and much more trustworthy if he actually comes up with a real commitment and really contribute something that is also costing him something.
Like the Mbema example. And if we then move on to the next sheet, there are a number of pivots that you can make. You can think about coming up with a different solution. You can actually focus on different customer segments. The people who have joined our first webinar may remember that the case we worked on for Remea, which is the climate at home proposition, initially the whole idea was centered around a B2C proposition, but it was only after validating it in the market we concluded that it actually needed to be a B2B proposition, which was quite a fundamental shift, as you can imagine, because then you need to change your customer, but you also then need to rework your solution. And in the end, you also need to rethink your channels. So that became sort of a almost like a full business model pivot.
Yeah.
There can also be a technology pivot, and sometimes, and that was one of the reasons why the e-bike project is now postponed. It's because things that you thought would work were not working. So in the end, we needed then to move to a different material. And then they said, well, but if we need to do that, then the solution we're offering is actually not the right fit anymore. So it is now concluded that, we need to stick with the intended technology in order to get the right solution. And we're not going to make that a technology pivot, which is, by the way, also an outcome. But I think these are all kind of examples where you could make a pivot if you're willing to. That also requires a bit of guts and also some free thinking, because quite often people are really sort of hooked to the initial idea, and you have to let go of that idea sometimes, rethink your assumptions, and worst case, you could even have to decide to kill the project altogether, even if it's not a hobby horse, so to say.
Yeah.
Well, a question to you: what is the pivot that you've performed most recently? Was that a solution pivot, a customer, a channel, a problem, or a technology, or maybe another pivot?
Yeah. Assuming that you have made pivots.
Yeah, well,
if not, you're not allowed to answer. Let that be clear.
I'm not obliged to answer. Let's be friendly, René. Yeah, it's kind of equally spread, which is kind of goes to show that all these pivots are relevant. I think more often people opt for the channel, customer, and solution pivots, slightly more on the customer side. That's interesting, by the way. You think you thought we had a sort of customer target segment, and in the end, you ended up with a different one, which is, by the way, also I think valuable insight you can gain from the validation. I mentioned that we did 1,200 people for the e-bike. In the end, we found out that was actually a segment that we did not really thought would be very interested. That they were actually quite interested in the proposition. So we included them in our sort of target focus. So validation will then also help you to sort of speed up in the scale-up phase.
Yeah.
About which more in our next
the
webinar.
Next example is also an interesting one, and it's about a company, JMango. JMango basically develops and sells software solutions for mobile e-commerce. And originally the company had developed a software solution for retailers who had a normal web shop, which was not yet optimized for mobile platforms. And the solution that JMango brought to these retailers made it possible to port an already existing web shop to mobile platforms. So what happened is that after some time, it turned out that the cost of acquiring a retailer as a customer did not outweigh the revenues generated by such an individual retailer. So basically, cost of acquisition was higher than the lifetime value of a customer. So several pivots were tested, including adapting the marketing and sales strategy to those retailers, but still the commercial costs of acquiring individual retailers remained too high in comparison to the lifetime value of those retailers. So next pivot involved selling the product as a white label solution to large e-commerce parties who would then take it with them as an integrated part of their entire solution portfolio. And this actually turned out to be a great success because a couple of months after having made that decision, JMango experienced their best quarter in its existence in Q1 in 2021, and results have been going up every quarter since then. So this is a clear example of a value chain or a distribution strategy pivot based on actual validation and proving via validation that the selected channel, being the direct to customer channel actually didn't work or worked, but resulted in too high costs of acquisition.
And it's, by the way, good news, if only because we're one of the minority shareholders in Gemengo. So we're quite committed to this company as well.
Yes.
And I think that what Gemengo also shows is that after sort of, well, kind of a search or a struggle is maybe too heavy a word to use, but I think it was a kind of a search on how do we get actually from being a startup to a scale up. I think we can now safely conclude that they actually made that transition from being a startup to actually now successfully scaling up and really hitting double-digit growth numbers, which I think is in the end what you would like to aim for with every innovation, isn't it? Because they were a startup just by nature, but even in larger corporates, new propositions, well, the moment you launch them, you really want them to actually scale up successfully. Climate at home, the other example we discussed, and which will, by the way, also be part of our next webinar on scaling up. They also took about 2 years to really, take off after a couple of pivots, and then only to scale up successfully. So validation is not something that is like, oh, we do it for a week and then it can actually involve many pivots. It can involve a year or 2 years trying to find the right fit, tweaking your business model along the way to then have, finding the right solution and actually scaling up, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in our next webinar. And that's how do you get from validation to scale up. That webinar will be held on the 4th of November. Later on, Rob will show the link to actually join that. We mentioned that we now get a bit of a promo section on the next sheet because as we mentioned during the webinar, there were a couple of resources that you can actually use during the validation phase, but also later on. We have the Dare book, which is on the table over here, written by our colleagues Matthijs Rosman and Erik de Groot. If you're interested in assessing your own innovation power, go to our website. We have an innovation readiness benchmark, which has already been taken by more than 250 companies. You can assess your innovation power on 35 best practices, and you'll get a very nice report comparing your scores with the 250 companies in our benchmark. You can download the playbook. We have lots of canvases in our growth warehouse. And if you're interested, just drop us an email or to Rob, who's been inviting you for this webinar. And you can always book a 30-minute consultation, free consultation with us. So enough, I think, about the promo or the commercial break, so to say. As said, you can join us in our next webinar on scaling up on the 4th of November. Rob is now making the link available. Which brings us to the end of the presentation part of this webinar. And I think we have around 10 minutes left for some questions. So please stay with us if you like to. Drop your questions in the chat and we will take them from there. I said the 4th of November and not the 14th. There was some confusion on that. So any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. And I think we had one from Veronique. How do you work out the budget you need to put towards enough validation? Well, I think, Veronique, that first of all starts, of course, with the size of the investment you're making and the risk when it's not right. So in the e-bike example, and let's stick with that as sort of a running case, they needed to make a commitment of roughly 8 million euros in the supply chain, which was ordering the bike. So 8 million, that's quite a lot of money, even if you have a well-financed investor behind you. So in the end, I think we spend around 30K on doing this validation, 35, which I think is compared to the risk you would take if you just make the order of 8 million for 8 million euro in bikes, and only to then find out that it was not right. And so here I think the financial risk was that high that sufficient budget is required. But quite often you can do it at very low cost, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve a lot of money, like René explained with the Mbema example.
Yeah, that's true. That required just a few customer interviews, and we spent indeed. Matthijs, thanks you. Matthijs already gave an answer to the question in the chat. We recommend not spending more than 10K in this phase, which was actually.
We did more, Matthijs. But there was a lot of money at stake.
We did more in the e-bike case, but that was because there was so much money at stake. So it's a fine balance, but it could be done by using minimal budget consumption.
Yeah.
But again, it depends a bit, as Mark explained, on how much money is at risk and how much money needs to be spent on the next phase.
Yeah. Any other questions? Rob, did we have questions earlier on in the
I
in
think
the
there
chat
was one in the
that we
beginning.
have not addressed yet?
I think it was actually the first one from
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah, is there a way to have an MVP that's interesting enough for today? Yeah, we discussed that already.
Okay.
Yeah, that's by acting not as if you're selling something, but really make it totally clear to your customers that you're validating something.
Yeah, how to convince the company client to invest in the validation phase. Yeah, I think in the end that comes down to
showing the risk if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what we did in the e-bike example. Say, okay, guys, are you really serious that we're going to commit the 8 million euros? Has this product been shown to customers? Yeah, actually they did, but it was then turned out that it was to a couple of families and friends. Well, that goes back to Veronique's earlier question. You can really argue whether family and friends are going to give you the right and honest answer, isn't it? If you're, so I think
you can argue, but the question is, the answer is probably no.
Probably not. No, exactly. So I think it really comes down to making the risk assessment. What if we are wrong on this critical assumption? What is the risk that we then run? And if that's sufficiently high, then the only way to mitigate it is to validate it as early as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no further questions, which there do not seem to be, then I would like to thank everybody for joining us in this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we also gave some useful insights to get better at validation, which we think is one of the critical phases and often forgotten phases by many companies in the innovation process. And we hope to see you again on the 4th of November in our next webinar. And thanks all for the kind remarks in the chat. Thanks for that.